Everyone in Crestwood Pines relied on the same Wi-Fi until my 13-year-old son changed the password. The next morning, the HOA president was pounding on our door in her bathrobe, screaming about her disconnected Peloton and frozen security feed. But what none of us knew then was that a single changed password would unravel a secret so big it would take down the entire HOA and turn my quiet, tech-obsessed son into a national headline. The morning sun filtered through the blinds as Nolan Whitaker sipped lukewarm coffee at the kitchen counter, scanning job boards on his aging laptop. Across the room, his 13-year-old son Micah was already deep into his own world, two monitors glowing in the dim corner of the living room, fingers flying over the keyboard, with a precision that Nolan had long given up trying to understand. It was just another Saturday in Crestwood Pines, a gated community known more for its manicured lawns and nosy neighbors than for its warmth. Since moving into his parents' old home a year after his wife passed, Nolan had kept a low profile. He didn't go to HOA meetings, he didn't attend the monthly potlucks, and he certainly didn't volunteer for block committees. He worked freelance IT gigs and homeschooled Micah, who preferred routers and code to basketball and birthday parties. But that quiet morning was about to explode. At 8:17 a.m., the front door rattled under a barrage of knocks that sounded like someone was trying to break in. Nolan startled, sloshing coffee down his shirt as Micah turned toward the noise, raising an eyebrow. Nolan opened the door to find Karen Fillmore standing on the porch in a silk robe and slippers, her phone in one hand and a printed HOA handbook in the other. Her hair was unbrushed, her face red with fury, and her voice hit decibels that could shatter glass. Did you touch the Wi-Fi?" she shrieked. "I can't access my camera feeds. My Peloton won't connect. My automatic sprinklers are spraying the neighbor's dog." Nolan blinked. "Good morning to you, too." Karen stormed past him into the entryway like she owned the place. "I knew it! I knew it was your son. I told the board we shouldn't let some rogue teenager manage the network." Micah stood slowly, calm and emotionless, as if this wasn't the first time he'd dealt with adult hysteria. "I changed the password this morning," he said, his voice steady. "There were 10 unidentified devices on the network. At least 3 were trying to access control panels they didn't belong to. So I secured it. Anyone who wants access again can request it." Karen's jaw dropped. "You don't have the authority to—" "I built the system," Micah interrupted, "and I'm the only one who knows how to maintain it." Nolan stepped between them. "Karen, I appreciate your concern, but maybe you should take this up with the HOA board." "I am the board," she snapped, jabbing a finger in the air, "and I'm issuing a formal citation for unauthorized disruption of HOA infrastructure." Micah tilted his head. "There's no clause about community Wi-Fi in the HOA charter. I read the bylaws last year." Karen's face flushed a deeper shade of red. She fumbled for words, then turned on her heel and stormed out, shouting over her shoulder. "This isn't over. That child is a menace." The door slammed shut, and silence settled back over the house. Nolan looked at his son, still standing calm and composed in his socks. "You changed the password without telling me?" Micah shrugged. It was time. Someone was snooping around. Nolan sighed and wiped the coffee from his shirt. "What did I say about poking the bear?" Micah sat back at his desk, eyes already scanning lines of code. "Bears don't scare me." Outside, Karen was already on the phone. Inside, something much bigger had just begun. 2 days passed in a tense silence that made Nolan uneasy. Micah seemed unaffected, spending his time tweaking scripts, tightening firewalls, and running packet sniffers across the newly secured network. But Nolan knew better than to assume things had blown over. Karen Fillmore didn't take embarrassment lightly, and for someone whose entire identity revolved around control of the HOA, control of her surroundings, control of appearances, being locked out of her own Wi-Fi by a teenager must have felt like a public humiliation. On Tuesday morning, Nolan stepped outside to retrieve the mail and found a bright yellow envelope taped to the front door. A citation. Violation 11.3b. Unauthorized modification of community infrastructure. Attached was a $250 fine and a thinly veiled threat that non-payment may result in further legal action and public HOA review. Nolan sighed and tore it in half. It wasn't even a real clause. That afternoon, 3 more letters arrived, this time in the mailbox. One cited excessive foliage height on their front lawn, even though Nolan had trimmed it 2 days prior. Another accused them of unapproved technological installation, whatever that meant. The third, his favorite, was a handwritten complaint that Micah had glared suspiciously at neighbors while walking to the mailbox, signed anonymously. "Welcome to Crestwood," Nolan muttered, tossing them into the trash. But while Nolan dealt with passive-aggressive paperwork, Micah was quietly building a case of his own. He noticed strange activity on the network logs, packets being sent to strange IP addresses, some rerouting through overseas proxies. At first, he thought it was just neighborhood devices syncing with cloud services, but the behavior repeated again and again, same times, same patterns. One night, he stayed up past midnight, routing traffic through a decoy node to see who was trying to get in. What he saw made him sit upright. "Dad," he said the next morning, holding his tablet with both hands, "someone's trying to get into our server." Nolan looked up from his coffee, alarmed. "What do you mean? Like a hacker?" Micah shook his head. "Number it's coming from inside the neighborhood. It's local. Could it be Karen? I don't know. But whoever it is, they're targeting our internal devices. Camera logs, cloud backup folders. They're looking for something." Nolan felt a chill crawl down his spine. "You can block them, right?" Micah nodded. "Already done, but I think I should trace it." "Trace it?" Nolan repeated. "Isn't that dangerous?" "Not if I use a proxy chain. I just need a few days." Nolan hesitated. He wanted to protect his son, but he also trusted him. Micah had never been reckless, just curious and precise. It was what made him so good. "Okay," Nolan said. "But if anything feels wrong, you stop immediately. Understood?" "Understood," Micah said, already typing. Later that day, Karen walked past their house with her tiny dog in tow, stopping to snap a photo of their porch light with her phone. She didn't wave. She didn't speak. And that night, Micah discovered something even stranger. One of the devices probing their system was labeled HOA-admin-laptop. He stared at the screen, then slowly smiled. "They're using the HOA's own network to try and breach ours," he whispered. That was a mistake. The following morning, Nolan woke to the sound of glass crunching under his boots as he stepped out onto the front porch. Someone had shattered their mailbox. The jagged metal post stuck out like a broken tooth, and pieces of shattered glass glittered in the grass below. On the porch railing, a freshly stapled notice flapped in the wind. Yet another violation, this one claiming failure to maintain a structurally safe mailbox. Nolan stood there in disbelief, wondering if anyone in their right mind could see the irony. Micah joined him a moment later, squinting at the debris. "They did this," he said flatly. "I know," Nolan murmured, jaw tightening, "but we need proof." Micah tapped his tablet and pulled up security footage. A figure in a hoodie had approached the mailbox around 2:41 a.m. The quality was grainy, and the person's face was obscured by the camera angle, but the height and posture seemed familiar. The person wore white sneakers with a bright purple logo, just like the ones Karen's nephew had worn at the last HOA barbecue. Micah froze the frame and zoomed in. "I can match this," he said. "Give me a few hours." Nolan frowned. "Are we really getting into that now?" Micah didn't look up. "Dad, someone is escalating. If we don't act, it's going to get worse." Nolan nodded slowly, watching his son's expression, focused, quiet, eerily calm. It reminded him of how Micah had reacted at his mother's funeral, grief buried under concentration. The boy never cried. He just worked. Meanwhile, the HOA's pressure campaign was reaching absurd levels. That afternoon, Nolan received an envelope hand-delivered by Karen herself. It contained a printed agenda for a special emergency HOA session, to vote on the termination of network responsibilities for the Whitaker residents. The wording was vague, but the message was clear. She wanted control back. Karen smiled as she handed it over. Just a formality, of course. We have to keep the community safe. From what? Nolan asked. Digital terrorism, she replied, her tone syrupy and condescending. You never know what kind of malware these kids can release. Nolan closed the door in her face. Inside, Micah had already launched a deep dive into the HOA's internal network. Earlier, he had intercepted fragmented data packets being sent from an HOA admin laptop to a private cloud drive. He was now decrypting them, bit by bit. There's a file here, he said slowly. Invoices, blueprints, permit requests, but something's off. What do you mean? They're signed by a building inspector who doesn't exist. I ran his name through the county database. No record. The permit number she submitted for the new tennis courts. It's fake. It was issued to a different community. She forged the documents. Nolan blinked. You're saying she's building on HOA land illegally? She's been funneling payments from HOA dues to a fake construction company. The payments are marked equipment rentals and land prep, but the company's address links back to a P.O. box in another state. Nolan stared at him. And you found all that by tracing her Wi-Fi? Micah shrugged. She never changed the default credentials on the router she's using. It's not even encrypted properly. Nolan leaned against the kitchen counter, the weight of the discovery settling on his shoulders. This isn't just petty now. This is fraud. Micah nodded. And I've got everything saved. Nolan thought about the smashed mailbox, the false citations, the surveillance footage. She's trying to ruin us because we're a threat to her secret. She picked the wrong tech-savvy kid, Micah said. That night, Nolan made a decision. They weren't going to back down. No more ignoring. No more appeasing. He opened his old email contacts from his journalism days and found the name of someone who might still be interested in stories like this. Someone who still cared about the truth. Micah, he said, how would you feel about going public? His son looked up. Let's burn it down. By Thursday, the evidence Micah had gathered was compiled into a meticulous digital folder, neatly organized, time-stamped, and encrypted. Nolan reviewed it multiple times, both impressed and uneasy. Every document, every screenshot, every packet capture painted the same picture. Karen Fillmore was laundering HOA funds through a fictitious contractor, faking permits, and weaponizing HOA bylaws to silence anyone who got too close. The implications were massive and dangerous. Nolan reached out to an old friend from his journalism days, Lyle Brenner, now an investigative reporter at a regional news outlet. He agreed to meet them at a local cafe, off the grid. Micah insisted on coming along, bringing his tablet with him like a soldier bringing a weapon to war. Lyle was skeptical at first, sipping burnt coffee while flipping through the files. It's good, he said slowly. Real good. But this kind of story needs more than just a tech-savvy kid and a paranoid dad. Micah looked up, eyes clear. Check the metadata. All of it lines up. The signatures are fake. The payment routing ends in Delaware with a shell corporation owned by her brother, who was arrested 3 years ago for tax evasion. Lyle paused, then leaned in. How did you find that? Micah tilted his head. You're asking the wrong question. You should ask why a 13-year-old can find it and no one else has. That silenced Lyle. He tapped his fingers on the table, then exhaled. All right, I'll talk to my editor. This could blow up fast. But back in Crestwood Pines, Karen was accelerating her offensive. That same evening, as the sun dipped behind the pine trees, 2 police cruisers pulled into the Whitakers' driveway. Neighbors peeked through blinds. Children froze mid-bicycle ride. A pair of uniformed officers approached the door with stern expressions. Mr. Whitaker, we received a report from the HOA of a possible cybercrime taking place in your residence, one said. Nolan raised his eyebrows. Cybercrime? You're kidding. Ma'am claims your son is accessing private medical records and interfering with community systems. Micah stood behind his father, calm as ever. Would you like to see the logs? I can show you every IP address, every encrypted file, every time-stamped interaction. And I can show you where the accusation came from. The officers exchanged looks. Nolan added, "And while you're here, you might want to look into the HOA president's finances. Her permit for the tennis courts is forged, her contractor doesn't exist, and my son has the receipts." One officer's eyebrows rose. The other turned toward Micah. "You're the kid from the network story last year? The security patch for the school system?" Micah gave a small nod. "Yeah," the officer muttered. "My nephew's a fan. Said you spotted a whole malware string in the district firewall. Karen had just called the cops on the wrong family." The officers left without pressing charges, but the damage was done. Emotionally, reputationally. Nolan could see it in Micah's face that night. He'd stood his ground, but something had changed. The stakes were higher now. The risk was real. Still, they pressed on. Lyle called the next morning. "We're going to publish. Sunday morning edition. My editor is all in." Nolan leaned back against the wall, letting the words settle in. "And you'll protect Micah's identity?" "As best we can. But once it's out, you might want to be ready." That Sunday, the front page headline read, "Teen Tech Prodigy Exposes HOA Fraud Scheme. Local President Implicated." By noon, the phones were ringing. Reporters, legal advisors, residents from other communities with similar stories. The HOA's general inbox crashed from traffic. Karen, meanwhile, had vanished from view. But as the storm outside intensified, the bond inside the Whitaker home only grew stronger. Nolan watched his son work at his desk, headphones on, calm despite the chaos. The boy had faced a corrupt system and answered it with truth, logic, and undeniable skill. And yet, neither of them could have guessed how much deeper this would go. Because what started as a neighborhood feud was only the surface. By Monday morning, Crestwood Pines was a different place. Cars crept by slowly, neighbors whispered on porches, and the HOA clubhouse remained locked with its shades drawn. Karen Fillmore had gone completely dark. No public statement, no online posts, no fiery HOA bulletins slid under doors. It was as if the queen of control had evaporated into thin air. But what unsettled Nolan most was the silence. It wasn't defeat. It was planning. Micah stayed vigilant. He installed extra security layers on all their devices and rerouted their home network through a rotating VPN. Even his phone was encrypted with an evolving firewall he coded himself. "Karen's not done," he said without emotion. "She's quiet because she's regrouping." Nolan didn't argue. He felt it too. The next strike came quietly, through the back door, figuratively and literally. That afternoon, Nolan returned home from a hardware store run to find their back gate pried open and muddy footprints trailing across the deck. Inside, nothing seemed stolen, but something was wrong. Micah was pale, standing at his desk, staring at his screen. "They accessed my terminal," he said quietly. "What do you mean?" "Someone came in through the back physically. They plugged in a USB device. It injected a silent execution script that wiped my local drives." Nolan felt sick. "You said you had backups." Micah nodded, already connecting to an off-site server. "They didn't touch the encrypted cloud copy. I backed everything up after the article went live." "Was it Karen?" Micah hesitated. "I'm not sure, but whoever did this knew what they were looking for." That night, they went through every frame of their home security cameras. Micah had programmed them to trigger motion capture in bursts. At 1:12 p.m., a figure in plain clothes and a ball cap entered the yard. No face, no clear shot. Just efficient movements. In one frame, a gloved hand reached toward Micah's computer tower. Then the screen cut to black. They printed the images anyway. The next morning, Nolan received an unexpected call. A man identifying himself as Agent Keene from the Department of Homeland Security asked to meet in person. In disbelief, Nolan agreed. An hour later, a sleek black sedan pulled up. Agent Keene was tall, clean-cut and polite, but direct. "We've been following HOA-related financial crimes across multiple counties," he said. "Most of them involve forged permits, misappropriation of dues, shell companies, exactly like what your son uncovered. Your article was our red flag. Nolan stared. You're telling me my kid cracked open a federal case? Keene gave a tight smile. You'd be surprised how often neighborhood corruption flies under the radar until someone smart enough notices the patterns. Micah didn't just catch Karen. He exposed a wider scheme. The company she funneled funds to? We've been tracking it. It's part of a network of paper businesses laundering HOA money across 3 states. And the IP that infiltrated your son's terminal yesterday belongs to a contractor on our radar. Micah looked stunned for the first time in days. They tried to erase me. They failed, Keene said. And now we're offering your family protection. And your son, mentorship, possibly even a placement. People like him don't come around often. Nolan struggled to absorb the words. For so long, he'd only seen Micah as a kid who preferred shadows and silence to socializing. Now he was being treated like a national asset. Before Agent Keene left, he handed Micah a sealed card. If you ever feel unsafe or see something we miss, call that number. You won't be ignored. As the sedan pulled away, Nolan stood with his son on the porch in stunned silence. This started with a password, Nolan finally said. Micah looked up at him. I guess I locked the wrong person out. Nolan shook his head, wrapping an arm around his son's shoulder. Number, you locked the right person out and opened the door for something bigger. The days that followed felt like a surreal blur. Agent Keene's visit had flipped the situation on its head. What began as a petty neighborhood feud had now escalated into a full-scale federal investigation. But instead of fear, Nolan felt a strange sense of clarity. For the first time since moving into Crestwood Pines, he and Micah weren't just surviving, they were fighting back, and they had backup. Karen Fillmore, however, was nowhere to be found. She had vanished from public view, her phone disconnected, her email bounced back, auto-replies. Her pristine silver Lexus sat unused in her driveway like a relic from another time. But the silence didn't last. On the 3rd day after the DHS meeting, a low-profile but powerful headline appeared in the national press. Federal authorities investigate widespread HOA corruption across multiple states. Whistleblower is 13-year-old tech prodigy. It didn't take long for the neighborhood to figure out who that prodigy was. By noon, Nolan's porch was flooded with reporters. Some offered money for interviews. Others simply shouted questions through the screen door. Nolan turned them all away, while Micah stayed upstairs, coding, rebuilding his wipe system from scratch. His quiet was never empty. It was focused, calculating, razor-sharp. Around sunset, a surprising knock came. Not a reporter, not the police. It was 3 of the HOA board members, standing together awkwardly in matching polo shirts with the Crestwood Pines emblem. Mr. Whitaker, the first one, a man named Saul, began, avoiding eye contact. We wanted to formally apologize for not stepping in sooner. Nolan didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch long enough for discomfort to settle. Finally, he crossed his arms and asked, "What exactly are you sorry for? The fake citations? The harassment? The fact that you let a corrupt woman bully residents while stealing from them?" The second board member, a petite woman named Yvette, swallowed. "We were afraid. She controlled everything. She even threatened to sue us personally if we questioned her finances." Micah appeared silently in the hallway behind Nolan. Fear doesn't excuse compliance. The board members turned, surprised by the boy's presence. He walked calmly to the edge of the porch and said, "You signed off on her permits. You approved reimbursements without verifying vendor legitimacy. Either you were complicit or you were negligent." Yvette blinked. "You're right." Micah tilted his head slightly. "So now what?" Saul took a deep breath. "We've formally voted Karen out. She's been removed from all HOA authority. We've appointed an interim president, and we want to rebuild trust. That starts with transparency. You and your father will be reimbursed for every fine, every fee, every expense caused by her abuse." Micah's expression didn't change. "And the surveillance footage, the vandalism, the break-in?" Yvette nodded quickly. We've turned everything over to the authorities. There was a pause. Then Nolan spoke quietly. If you want trust, show up at the next board meeting with real reform proposals, not empty words. The board left, humbled, and Nolan closed the door gently behind them. He looked at Micah, whose face remained unreadable. You okay? He asked. Micah nodded. They're scared. That's why they're apologizing. But it's a start. Later that night, as they sat on the back porch, a soft breeze rustling the trees, Micah pulled a small envelope from his hoodie pocket. Agent Keene dropped this off earlier today. Nolan opened it slowly and found a simple letter printed on government stationery. It congratulated Micah for his contributions to national cybersecurity efforts and invited him to attend a summer program in Washington, D.C., a mentorship camp for youth with exceptional talents in digital forensics, encryption, and threat detection. All expenses paid, sponsored by the Department of Homeland Security. Nolan couldn't speak for a long moment. His eyes welled up and his voice cracked as he finally said, You did this, son. Micah looked down at his hands. I just wanted a safer neighborhood. Nolan smiled, voice thick with pride. You made the whole country safer. Micah left for Washington, D.C. 2 weeks later. Nolan drove him to the airport at dawn, the sky still pale and empty above the highway. They didn't talk much during the ride, just quiet glances, a shared understanding that something monumental had shifted. Micah wasn't just going to a summer camp. He was stepping into a new life, one that most kids his age couldn't even imagine. When they arrived at the terminal, a uniformed federal escort greeted them near the check-in counter. Agent Keene wasn't there, but he had sent a colleague named Ms. Patel, who greeted Micah with a genuine smile and a respectful nod. We've been looking forward to meeting you, she said. You're already a legend in some of our circles. Micah nodded politely, then turned to Nolan. I backed up all the systems at home. You just need to hit restore if anything breaks. Nolan smiled through the tightness in his chest. I'll try not to blow anything up. The goodbye was brief, but emotional. Micah wasn't one for long hugs, but he let his father wrap him up for a moment before pulling back. I'll be back before the 4th of July, he said. I'll be waiting, Nolan replied, ruffling his hair. As the plane took off, Nolan stood near the glass window long after the aircraft disappeared into the clouds. It hit him all at once. How far they'd come, from isolation and grief to exposure, resistance, and now recognition. His son had turned their neighborhood nightmare into a national turning point. Back in Crestwood Pines, things continued to shift. The interim HOA board held its first public meeting without Karen, and nearly the entire neighborhood showed up. What started as a tense atmosphere gradually softened as people began to speak honestly about the fear, the manipulation, the silencing. One by one, residents admitted that they had ignored the red flags because it was easier than confronting power. Nolan stood up near the end of the meeting. He didn't speak to accuse or to gloat. He simply said, What happened here should be a warning, but also a reminder. The systems that govern us can be abused if we're not vigilant, but they can also be reclaimed. That speech was recorded and shared across multiple HOA forums online. It gained traction far beyond Crestwood Pines. Soon, other neighborhoods began asking questions, forming reform committees, investigating irregularities in their own boards. Then, one afternoon, Nolan received an unmarked package at his door. Inside was a USB drive, a short typed note, and a photo. The note read, In case you ever need to finish what your son started, there's more. The photo was of a woman, middle-aged, familiar, Karen Fillmore. But it wasn't current. It was old, perhaps from her college years. And beside her stood a man in a suit, with the same last name as one of the board members, who had resigned after the article went public. Nolan stared at the image. What did you leave behind, Karen? Micah returned home just before the holiday as promised. He was different, but not in a way Nolan feared. More focused, more centered. There was a quiet confidence in his posture, a subtle depth in how he listened before speaking. At dinner that night, Nolan asked him, "Did they challenge you?" Micah nodded. "Every day. I loved it." "And you want to do more of this?" Micah looked at him across the table. "I think I'm supposed to." Nolan didn't argue. He just nodded. "Then I'll be beside you for every step." That night, as fireworks lit up the sky above Crestwood Pines, Nolan and Micah stood side by side on the porch, watching the colors burst against the stars. For the first time in a long time, there was peace in the neighborhood. But in the back of Nolan's mind, he knew, this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the end of the first chapter. A month after Micah's return from Washington, life in Crestwood Pines had settled into something that resembled peace, but the kind of peace that's layered with unspoken truths. Nolan had taken a step back from work to spend more time with his son, and Micah, though still consumed with coding and building digital defenses, now made time for walks with his dad, sometimes even bike rides around the lake. The community had softened too. Neighbors who once avoided them now waved. Several came by with casseroles and quiet apologies. It wasn't perfect, but it was healing. One warm Saturday morning, as Nolan was clearing out the garage, Micah appeared with the USB drive and the photo they had received anonymously weeks earlier. He placed them gently on the workbench and said, "I think we should look deeper." Nolan had considered doing it for weeks. There was something in the tone of that note. "There's more," that felt unfinished, like a thread left hanging. Together, they plugged the USB into Nolan's laptop and opened the encrypted file. It took Micah only a few minutes to crack the password. Inside was a folder labeled CF, Internal Communications. Hundreds of emails, meeting notes, financial transfers, some between Karen and her brother, but others were more disturbing. Exchanges between Karen and other HOA presidents in neighboring communities. They weren't just mismanaging funds, they were colluding, sharing fake vendor templates, trading forged signatures, coordinating lawsuits against homeowners who resisted. "This isn't just a scam," Micah said slowly. "This is organized. They've been doing this for years." Nolan scrolled through the emails in stunned silence. Names he recognized, addresses in his county. One message referenced a Whitaker protocol, a blueprint Karen had written to discredit anyone who got too close to uncovering fraud, based entirely on her experience with Nolan and Micah. "She tried to turn us into a cautionary tale," Nolan said bitterly. Micah looked at him. "But we became the warning." They spent the next few days compiling the new data. Agent Keene returned in person once they contacted him. He sat at their kitchen table and read every line without saying a word. Finally, he closed the laptop and said, "This confirms what we suspected but couldn't prove. Your family just became the keystone witness in a federal racketeering case." Nolan exhaled slowly. "What happens next?" "Federal indictment, multiple arrests. And if you're willing, your story goes national." Micah looked up from his tablet. "Can we protect the other neighborhoods?" Keene nodded. "With your help, yes. You may have just saved hundreds of families." The following week, the news broke nationwide. Micah's name was kept anonymous in most outlets, but the legend of the Crestwood Kid spread fast. Communities across the country began auditing their HOA boards. Several arrests followed within days. Karen's brother was found hiding in a cabin 2 states away. Karen herself was discovered attempting to cross the border under a false name. She was arrested, handcuffed at the airport, and her mugshot made headlines. Back at Crestwood, the HOA was restructured entirely. A new board was elected, this time by secret ballot, with public audits and third-party oversight. In a community vote, it was unanimously decided to name the community center after someone who had never wanted credit but had changed everything. The sign was unveiled on a sunny morning. "The Micah Whitaker Center for Digital Integrity and Youth Innovation." Micah stood awkwardly next to it in his hoodie, while Nolan wiped a tear from his eye and laughed softly. "You're officially a building." Micah rolled his eyes. "That's weird." You're weird, Nolan said, nudging him playfully. As they walked back to their house, Nolan looked up at the sky. The neighborhood felt different now, lighter. Not because the corruption had vanished overnight, but because someone had stood up to it. Someone small, someone young, someone with a password and a sense of right and wrong. They stepped inside as the sun filtered through the windows. The old rooter sat on the desk, still humming. Micah paused, then turned to his father. Should I reset the password again? Nolan grinned. Only if Karen tries to log in from jail. They both laughed, and for the first time in a long time, it wasn't to chase away the fear, but because the storm had passed and they had made it through together. From an author's perspective, the ending of the story is not just satisfying, it's deeply symbolic. What began as a neighborhood dispute over something as seemingly trivial as a Wi-Fi password grew into a powerful narrative about truth, resilience, and the quiet genius often overlooked in society. Micah's transformation from a reclusive, tech-savvy boy into a national force for justice isn't just about his intellect. It's about his integrity, his calm in the face of corruption, and his refusal to be intimidated by power. The real beauty of the ending lies in the fact that justice was not delivered by force, but by logic, persistence, and moral clarity. That a child, guided by ethical conviction and supported by a loving parent, could unravel a system of adult deceit is a powerful reminder of how underestimated truth-tellers can be. The final image, Micah asking whether he should change the password again, is both humorous and poignant. It brings the story full circle, reminding us that sometimes the smallest actions, resetting a password, questioning authority, standing your ground, can have the biggest consequences. The story ends not just with justice served, but with a community transformed, and a future rewritten by those who dared to ask the right questions. It's a reminder that courage doesn't always look like grand speeches or clenched fists. Sometimes it looks like a quiet kid behind a glowing screen, choosing to do what's right when no one else will. Would you like an AI-generated image prompt for the most intense scene in the story? I can craft one in English with detailed visual guidance, lighting, emotion, number of characters, etc., for a realistic style.